Hello and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. I'm Gareth Thorne from interest.co.nz. In 1972, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, research team published what was to become a famous and influential book. The Limits to Growth concluded that if present growth trends in world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and resource depletion continued unchanged, the limits to growth on a finite planet would be reached sometime within the next 100 years. The most probable result, the MIT researchers added, was a rather sudden and uncontrollable decline in both population and industrial capacity. Our guest for this episode is someone who did a study updating the limits to growth for the modern world, receiving significant international interest. She is Gaya Herrington. Hi, Gaya, and welcome to the Of Interest podcast. It's great to have you with us.
Great to be here.
So look, you're currently the Vice President for ESG Research at Schneider Electric, and you've previously worked for both KPMG and the Dutch Central Bank. But could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and how and why you decided to update the limits to growth?
Yeah. So that's right. I started actually in the financial sector, and then I was working at the Dutch Central Bank through the global financial crisis, and then you saw then how interconnected everything was, right? And I know that we were monitoring that quite separately: liquidity risk, capital risk, market risk, and then you saw how that all interacted, and only then did I start to think, well, what if many more risks are interconnected? And what if all these environmental and social risks that you see, the growing income and wealth inequality, climate change, obviously, biodiversity loss, what are the financial risks of that? And will that exacerbate it? And I couldn't find any satisfying answers to that. That's not what I was taught in my econometrics classes. And so I went back to school, to Harvard, to study sustainability. And that's how I ultimately ended up at this model, this first systems model of the world that, in fact, did connect all these different kind of variables, right? And I thought, oh, this was done in the 70s. So we have a few decades worth of empirical data. Let's see how that worked out. And so that's what I did my thesis on. And then, of course, I found that the track with that the empirical data tracked some of the scenarios from that world model quite closely. I think I've seen a lot of models in my life. I don't know of another model that was this accurate decades into the future. And so that's probably also why it went viral at the time.
Yeah, no, there was certainly plenty of interest in it. So a key feature of the limits to growth, as you sort of alluded to there, is its use of system dynamics. Now, can you tell us what this actually is?
Yeah. So I think many of your listeners are probably familiar with what I would call the more mainstream models. So you have most variables in there are exogenous, they are assumed, right? And then you have a few one-on-one endogenous variables, and you try to model that. And I'm very familiar with those models as well. But in a complex system, such as a world as well, probably, or our society, you have all variables can be endogenous and they interact with one another. And they can be a very different kind of nature. So they can be not just economic and financial, meaning easily quantifiable, right? But they can also be social and environmental, behavioral. That's very hard to quantify, but it doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of influence in the system. And so dynamic systems modeling is really something that actually captures that kind of interactions much better. And what you see with those models is that you get the kind of behavior like long feedback delays or explosive growth or exponential decay, all those things. So non-linear behavior. And so that's probably why it's, for many cases, it's a better model to use. And especially, I would say, for something as complex as our world.
Certainly, there's lots of moving parts in a world. So with your update to the limits to growth, what were your conclusions and how accurate did you think that their work had proven to be?
Yeah, indeed. So you mentioned a couple of variables already. So they modeled global variables only, population, food production, industrial output, pollution, but also things like welfare levels, our ecological footprint, human services, which were mostly education and health services. So all these different kind of variables, right? And so with that model, they made different kind of scenarios. They changed underlying assumptions, and then with that, based on those different assumptions, they created different scenarios. So there was one business as usual scenario, which ran only on historical averages, and then there were other another scenario, for example, was comprehensive technology, in which it was assumed that humanity was much more technologically innovative than in the past, so very optimistic rates of innovation. And there was also a stabilized world scenario. In that scenario, humanity consciously capped its industrial output and shifted the resources that were freed up with that towards human health services and education, and also pollution abatement. And there were quite different outcomes. And the business as usual was the one published most widely at the time, because that showed a collapse pattern. So collapse is a very loaded word. It doesn't mean the end of humanity, but it does mean a steep decline from a previous peak to the point where the system that we had before that, so say our economic system, has lost its key identity and will not be able to keep functioning again like that. So what that means is humanity will have to build a new system. So it's still quite dramatic, right? It's still a steep decline from a previous peak. In the stabilized world scenario, humanity avoids that collapse and we maintain high welfare levels. What was so interesting about this model, I thought, was that it indicated that our peak welfare levels would be around now. So right now, we would be at the highest level, globally speaking, right? This is a global, so it doesn't take into account that, of course, there's a lot of difference in the welfare of you and I, and some people in Afghanistan, say, for example. But in general, at a global level, we would be at a peak welfare, and we would have a choice to maintain it, or it will go down. And so what I found when I did an empirical data check is that we are most closely aligned with business as usual. However, so that means that we're not on a sustainable trajectory, which, if you listen to any kind of report coming out of the scientific community lately, should not be a huge surprise that what we're doing is not sustainable. But what I also found is that we are not that far removed from stabilized world yet. So while this whole speaking of collapse is often interpreted as a prediction of doom, it's not a prediction at all. It's a scenario analysis. So it's a way of understanding global dynamics. And so it's a warning that right now we're not on a sustainable path, but we actually have the opportunity to align ourselves more with something like a stabilized world scenario.
Okay. So you've also published a book called 5 Insights for Avoiding Global Collapse. So that word collapse again. But you say, look, all is not lost yet. In your book, your conclusion starts off by saying, I don't know whether humanity will make the necessary radical improvements to avoid collapse. So what are these radical improvements, and how much time do we have to make them?
Yeah. So that's, I think, one of the key challenges now is really the little time we have left, I will say. When the MIT scientists came out decades ago, at that point, we were not yet in Earth overshoot. We've been above Earth's carrying capacity since the 70s. This book, Limits to Growth, was published in 1972. So if we had heeded that warning back then, we could have a relatively smooth transition. But unfortunately, that possibility has been squandered. And so now we have to make radical changes. So it will be a bumpy ride, one way or another, unfortunately. So what are these radical improvements? Well, what happens in the stabilized world scenario, right? What is a society that changes, that says we're going to deliberately cap our industrial output, and shift the resources that are freed up towards human services and pollution abatement. Basically, what that is, that's a society that says, at some point you have enough stuff. That's what industrial output is. At some point, it doesn't make us much happier to to have more stuff. But what we are going to invest in now is human well-being. That's what the education and health services mean to me. And so it aligns a lot with a lot of other economic frameworks that you see coming out, such as Kate Raworth's donut economics, right? It says the same thing. We need to shift the goal of growth, continue ever producing ever more stuff, to meeting human needs within ecological limits. So that's what that means, I think.
Yeah. I just want to go back to the collapse word again. So, I mean, what would collapse mean in the context that you're talking about? And I mean, is simply avoiding that collapse the key goal here, or is there more to the goals?
Excellent question. Well, what I just described, right, isn't that something that we would want to do anyway? So the short answer to your question would be no. I'm like, that sounds like a more pleasant place to live in anyway, right? A society that says, okay, we're gonna, not just pursue continuous growth within and of itself is not very satisfying. And people in living lucky enough to live in countries like New Zealand or the US where I live, certainly depends on the class in the US, but or the Netherlands where I was born. Even there, you see that the majority of people, this is very clear from surveys, feel disengaged at work. A lot of people feel that their jobs are just tricks for money. And so you see this in finance, where I worked a lot, where people were actually quite honest. They said, I don't like my job, but I have a family now, and it's very high paying. And so even people who are on the winning side of this system are actually not that fulfilled by it. And that's because just more stuff doesn't actually make us happier. Just pursuing growth doesn't make us happier. It's promised, it's upheld as such, right? It has by now gotten a spiritual dimension, I would say. It's equated to progress. But, and I think that's one of the key things that I challenge in this book, where I say, well, maybe progress is embracing it, going from never enough to enough for each. And instead of ever more, just strive for better. And I think that's one of the, for me, that would be progress here, where we embrace the concept of enough, or as in Europe, I think the term they start to use more and more is sufficiency. And I think that's really a key challenge that we're facing right now. Like I said, by all accounts, we are at peak welfare right now. So growth will halt one way or another. So either we choose our own limits by capping, moving away from producing ever more stuff, or they will be forced upon us. So your question, and that would be collapse, right? And so what would that look like? In very practical terms, decline in population by and not in a great way, of where people just slowly start to choose less and less children, but where people die of the droughts and the famine that is caused by, for example, climate change and other natural destruction. Increased conflict, resource scarcity, that sort of thing. That is certainly something that it seems that we're heading right now, but I also would say we don't have to do that. We can still avoid a collapse. We will still see the end of growth, but growing forever on a finite planet is simply not an option. So that limit we will have reached one way or another. And it's now more of a question of, do we maintain this level or do we allow it to go down?
So the word growth obviously comes up a lot in this. I mean, right back to the title of the limits to growth, and in your subsequent work as well. Now, I mean, obviously advocates of growth will say, oh, it's helped lift billions of people out of poverty and etc. So I'm just interested in talking a bit more about growth. I mean, you're advocating for a different goal than growth, and you say in the book, this isn't the same as being anti-growth. So just wondering, and also it says striving for a different purpose than GDP growth or profits is not the same as advocating for degrowth. So of course there is a bit of a degrowth movement these days. So I guess you're advocating for, you're saying people having what they need rather than necessarily what they want.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect to it as well, right? I think right now we've muddied the waters quite well between needs and wants, but they're actually quite different. And so I'm not anti-wants, for example, but I do think needs should come above wants. Wants can be are endless, and they can and they're very varied. Needs are actually universal. The social research is quite clear about that. And so when our needs are satisfied, they can actually be satisfied, and so that's great news if you're in a naturally constricted world. It's not great news for growth. For growth, you want wants because you can stimulate those endlessly. And I think to what you pointed out at the beginning was, well, isn't that necessary for lifting people out of poverty? I think this is indeed a very persistent myth. And what we get to there really is talking about vested interest and perhaps how we want to talking about whether we can whether the ultra wealthy in society can hold on to their enormous concentration of wealth in a no growth society. And I think the answer to that is no. And I think that's also why this myth is being fed so consistently. If you look at the people, most of the people that have been lifted out of poverty, that these people are talking about over the past few decades, are in Asia. And that's true, but at the same time, we need more of that. Poverty needs to be eradicated. But that's precisely the point. The way that it has happened doesn't seem to be possible for the rest of the people on the planet, because that also raised their ecological footprints above one Earth. And so we need to find ways to do that without the same ecological footprint. There's plenty of research that shows this is possible. There is no evidence that this is possible without the ultra wealthy giving up anything that they have now. And I think that's why growth has been pushed so much as the solution, because growth is the only way that people can be lifted out of poverty without people who have an enormous amount of money giving any of it up. So I think that's one of the key things here. There's no doubt that in a future of like the stabilized world scenario, or say a donut economy, a post-growth economy, that money needs to be circulated a lot more as well, and cannot be allowed to be concentrated to this enormous extent.
It's an interesting point on that you're talking about the very wealthy. I mean, what sort of level of wealth are you talking about? And how are these people going to be convinced that they need to give up some of their wealth or most of their wealth?
Yeah.
Because some of them aren't going to want to.
No.
Most of them probably.
True. Yeah, I think, it's interesting. We know probably one of the people that's probably most famous about from writing about collapse is Jared Diamond, right? And he has a quote in his book, Collapse, that I quite like. He says, throughout history, the rich and powerful thought that their wealth could protect them from collapse, and all they ever bought was the privilege of perishing last. And I think so that's one argument that we all share. We're all in the same boat. You cannot insulate yourself from the polycrisis that has already started to unfold. So there's that. There's the self-interest. It is very clear from social research that in equal societies, so less economically, so societies with less income and wealth inequality, everybody is much happier, even the people at the top. However, that's very different from saying, oh, but these people are the multi-billionaires are now going to be happier when we take most of their money away. That's not the same thing. You're absolutely right. We have we all have this psychological bias against loss. And so I don't think that's going to be that easy. I think they're going to have to be forced to, some of them, some billionaires are arguing for higher taxes, but some of them are actively resisting that. I do think some of them have to be forced through government. And I hope that they would realize that is in their best interest, because the social unrest will not go away otherwise.
What role is there for technology in helping us, do you think?
Technology is going to be absolutely critical. However, it is not a savior. It is a tool. And so there's a very strong, there's a very strong narrative as well that we're going to innovate ourselves out of this situation. There's absolutely no evidence on that. So if you look at this what I think by now is you can call a myth of green growth, where we keep growing, but we decouple it from the environmental impacts. You just don't see that, even if it's measured just by carbon emissions, and that's just one impact, right? There's zero evidence for it when it comes to resource extraction and biodiversity loss, for example. But even carbon emissions, you see some minor relative decoupling, but not nearly to the extent where you can say, oh yeah, so this country managed to grow while reducing its carbon emissions. You just don't see that. And so and I think the reason for that is quite simply that first of all, we also need to consume less, and second of all, as long as you have a system, the goal of a system dictates, it resonates throughout everything. So as long as the system's goal is growth, the technology as a tool will support that goal. If we shift the goal towards meeting human needs within planetary boundaries, then the technology will become an absolutely key element of the solution.
Obviously, you've talked a bit about how you worked in the we talked about how you worked for the Dutch Central Bank. So you worked in the banking sector, or with the banking sector, the regulation of the banking sector. You've worked for KPMG. You're pretty familiar with the financial world. What do you think the role of finance is in achieving what you'd like to see achieved?
Finance is a very unique animal. I think it's such a unique sector. Obviously, it's one of those other sectors that's going to have an absolutely key role to play. There's no denying that that all of these changes need massive investment, and so private sector investment will have to be a part of that as well. Right now, it's very clear that the financial sector is too much focused on short term. I think we all know this, and short term growth would actually also impede on long term growth. But it's very still short term growth driven, and I think in that sense, just incorporating some ESG elements will not be enough for the enormous transformations that we need. So, you really have to look at the more niche banks that are starting to adopt a much more, less, a different kind of attitude, such as Triodos Bank, for example, in the Netherlands, but also really credit unions, for example. It goes way more back to the roots of what banking was, right? They don't have a profit motive. And they're doing quite well. So 1 out of 5 people in the US actually is a customer at a credit union. That's a non-profit bank. So I see a lot more future for those, and more hope in those kind of financial instruments.
So one thing I'm really interested in this whole thesis is that we're sort of talking about people, certainly in the developed world, in countries like the US, where you are, Netherlands, where you're from, and New Zealand, obviously, where I am. We're talking about people really needing to change their lifestyles, I think. And that obviously can be hard to convince them that they should do. So, and then I guess if you look at people in developing countries or poorer countries who might desire the luxuries and wealth of the developed world, we're saying, no, that's too much. You can't have all that, which, also some of them will resent that. So I'm just wondering, like, are you confident that human nature can move to do what is required to do? And obviously, we've talked about billionaires a bit. I mean, politicians are another group who often have a very short-term focus. In New Zealand, we have an election in October, so none of them are really looking beyond that at the moment here. So I'm just, do you think human nature, politicians, and I guess a sort of individualism that people often have, will it allow us to do what we need to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. When it comes to human nature, historians have studied this, and Jared Diamond is one, but certainly not the only one. Rihanna Eisler has done a lot of work. And certainly this idea of we have an entire plethora of values, and individualism and self-interest are in there, but we are also very much social animals, and we are wired for connection and cooperation, and we have a very deeply ingrained sense of fairness, for example. So it really depends. So going back to what you mentioned, the needs versus wants, if you go to the needs part, when our basic needs are not met, it's certainly true, we are very selfish and short-term focused. But once they are met, we actually become very curious, very social, and really quite altruistic. And so yes, I do believe we have that in us. You also see that in history, that societies have been able to make these transformations when their environmental limits force that upon them. Of course, collapses are also not. They're also in our history, so it can go both ways. Many factors can influence that. And so it's really, but it is ultimately a choice that we as a community make. And I would say that the responsibility lies on the shoulders of the people who have their basic needs met, because they can do that. We are not, a very strong narrative is still, probably for me, I was taught that, but also probably your listeners that have heard of the Homo economicus. But it turns out it doesn't describe us very well, right? We know that also already since the 70s with Kahneman and Tversky's paper, etc. We're much more like a Homo duplex. So again, when our basic needs are not met, we are selfish. But above that, we're driven by very different motives. So we actually suffer when we don't have a connection with our community, and when we feel that what we do on a daily basis does not really contribute much to society. So I would say so yes, you will have to content yourself with less stuff, certainly. I think, and that is, I do think that's our responsibility. I don't think that's so much to give up, because what you get back for that is a much stronger sense of community and a purpose that is actually fulfilling, instead of quite more external validation kind of thing that we see now in I think large parts of the developed world. So so I think, yes, I do think we're going to give something up. I also think we're going to get a lot back for it, and not in the least a prosperity that can last. And it's hard to, and you see this is very widespread, especially among the younger younger generations. There's a lot of anxiety for the future, because they already sense that it cannot last, right? And it's hard to be happy in the moment if you feel that your future is uncertain.
One of the other things I was keen to ask you about is agriculture. So New Zealand, like your homeland of the Netherlands, is a major agriculture nation, a big exporter of agricultural products. And the agricultural sector here contributes about half of New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions. But the climate pollution from livestock isn't priced here, and this is an ongoing debate in New Zealand about when it will be and how it should be, and of course, as I mentioned, the election coming up, so parties have got different policies on that. What I'm interested in is what role you see for agriculture in helping avoid the collapse, and what it perhaps needs to, does it need to give anything up?
Yeah, no, I mean, another sector that's of course pivotal, right? Because we all need to eat, but it's also the largest driver of biodiversity loss at the moment. So we're living in the sixth mass extinction. We've already lost almost 70% of wildlife population since the 70s, which is truly staggering to think about. But yes, we do need to eat, and but the way we're growing it now is drives desertification and that sort of thing. So the way we're producing food right now is also not sustainable. There are ways to do regenerative agriculture, for example. So that's the kind of transformation we would need in the agricultural sector. Massively reduce food waste, because I think in the West we throw away about a third of what is produced uneaten. In the US it's 40%. And so obviously reduce waste there. But also the way we grow it can be done in a regenerative way, but that demands nothing short of a transformation in that sector, right? But that's what's required. Again, also, that will, some vested interest there will have to give something up.
I'm interested in taking you sort of back to the limits to growth in 1972. I'm just wondering, like, I mean, obviously the book gained a lot of attention at the time, and obviously it's become very famous, and there were 2 follow-up books written subsequently. But I'm just wondering, you know, you mentioned that in your research it showed that the model that the world's primarily been following since then is the business as usual one. So, I mean, obviously the powers that be didn't just immediately go, oh, well, yeah, this book is right, we need to massively change our ways. We kept traveling a very similar path than we were before the book came out. I'm wondering what you think the world might look like today if that limits to growth advice had been acted upon after the book came out in the early to mid 70s.
Oh, wow. I think it would have looked better, Gareth. I truly think so. I think, like I said, we weren't above Earth's carrying capacity yet. And so we could have had a relatively smooth transition. And at that time in the 70s, there really was quite an appetite for it, even in the US. But at least, I don't know how it went in New Zealand, but certainly here, it really seemed like a fluid situation where it could have gone there. And then here we had the Montpellier Society that came out in full force, preaching neoliberalism, free market, small government, and they did so very successfully. And we went a different way. Right, and what we would have seen is if that hadn't gone that direction, I think is a country with, first of all, a lot less species lost, because that's the thing about biodiversity loss, right? That can never be undone. Yeah, if a species lost, they're gone. A lot more social cohesion. The US at the time, one of its strengths, really underestimated, I think, undervalued, was its social capital. And they had such a strong narrative, like it really was the United States. And that has, having lived here now for 9 years, you can see how much that social fabric has been fraying under the massive income and wealth inequality. And so I think we would have seen a country that was still much more united, and had much more of its natural capital intact, and see much less social conflict, and just in general a place where you could speak of true prosperity, not just a rich country. The US is rich; it's the richest country in the world, but it's not that. If you look at certain statistics like life expectancy, the amount of people, the amount of children growing up in poverty, that sort of thing, it really is, it isn't that prosperous. I think it would have been a more prosperous country.
I guess finally, I'm just interested to hear how optimistic you are that humanity can make the changes that you're advocating for over coming years. I mean, do you think that we can do it? And why do you think? And if you do, why?
I certainly think we can do it. We absolutely can. We have the technology, and we have the policies. We know what to do. If it's politically feasible, I'm making quotation marks here with my fingers. That's the second one, but we absolutely know what to do. We have the solution, so we can. I also think that we want to. I think it's very clear actually from surveys that the majority of the population wants deep systemic changes. So certainly the younger generation, right? That's what they mean when they say systems change, not climate change. That's what they mean. They say change this economic system. But in general, you see this. It's very clear from surveys across the globe, really. Not even just in developed countries, although certainly mostly there more than anywhere else. But really across the globe, you see people that they want deep systemic changes in their economies and in the political systems. So even in the US, where there are very large pockets of very conservative people, even there, even among Republicans, for example, they want higher taxes on the wealthy, a majority of them. So we want this. Will we, is then the question. And I don't know. I think I don't know, because we've seen in history that it can go either way. I do think that we will stop growing one way or another. That I think that's very clear. I think what we're seeing already is a destabilization of the system. So what you typically see when a system goes into collapse, you have reached a peak, and after that there starts to be a destabilization, sort of a flickering of things. Things start to, the World Economic Forum calls it the polycrisis. So you have all these things that seem unrelated, but of course they are. They have an underlying root cause. And so if you don't heed that, if you just look at this as separate crises that just temporary, and then we will go back to business as usual, and you don't address the root cause, you get into breakdown. So that's where the system really breaks down, but it can start back up. If you don't heed that and you let it start back up and you're like, yeah, we're back to normal, you probably slide towards collapse. And that's where you cannot go back to the previous system. So in that sense, it will happen one way or another. But of course, I would prefer that we heed the destabilization phase and make use of this fluidity that it's creating and create that new economic system there, so we don't have to slide further down.
I said that was the final question, but I do just want to jump in with one more there. This new economic system, I mean, what would be the key? I mean, I know we have touched on this through the interview, but just to sort of summarize there, what would be the key aspects to this new economic system, do you think?
Yes. No, thank you for asking. So that would be a system where we first and foremost have replaced the ultimate goal of the economic system, which currently clearly is growth. People say it's something else, like alleviating poverty, but it's not. Because if we really wanted to alleviate poverty directly, we would have been able to do that by now. So the goal right now is growth. That new economic system, it cannot have that goal. That will be replaced by something else, which of course I think should be meeting human needs within ecological limits. And so that doesn't mean you're anti-growth. If growth then contributes to human well-being and can do that with a low environmental impact, we will still do it. And if not, we won't bother, right? So that's ultimately what it comes down to. What does that mean in practice? It means that one way or another, through, for example, social enterprise, so companies that are genuinely not ultimately driven by profit. Again, they can be profitable. They probably, if they do a good job, they will be, but it will not be their ultimate purpose, which is, by the way, of course, something that companies already say, right? No company has as their mission statement to get profit. They always have something else. So we're already feeling at somewhere, it's not that radical if you think about it. We're all kind of already pretending that that's what we're doing, but it's not ultimately the goal. So this would be an economy where that mission statement is actually true, And then either through those social enterprises and or through the government, which will have an important role, I think, as well. I think government can be too big, certainly. It can definitely also be too small. I would say in the US, it's probably too small right now. And either way, all the services will be aimed directly at meeting human needs. We want to eliminate poverty because it's bad for human needs, certainly. Doesn't contribute to human well-being. We're going to eradicate it. That's our plan. We have a war now against poverty. We have a war against hunger, children being homeless, those kind of things. That's the kind of economy that we would be living in.
Well, Gaya, thanks so much for that. It's a fascinating conversation. That's Gaya Herrington, and I'm Gareth Vaughan from interest.co.nz with another episode of our Of Interest podcast.